So I'm doing these videos mainly out of interest for myself and for people to watch. I'm not working professionally in any capacity in North Africa, but
Mm,
I'm working on a synthesis paper that's looking at metallurgy histories across the world. And we had
okay.
a meeting in Liverpool a few years ago, and there's just so little, we recognize that there's so little known about the mining and metallurgical history of Africa. I mean,
Mm,
it goes back thousands of years.
mm,
And
yeah.
most of the paleo metallurgy history work is focused on Western Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia. Very little work has been done in looking at the mining metallurgy histories of the African mines. We were just kind of catching up, talking, waiting for you to come on. So we started recording. And so I guess this is the time for the formal introductions. So thank you so much for joining Johannes and Nada. I know it's late for both you and you both have families. We are doing this discussion on the opposite sides of the world for those that are watching. I'm in Hawaii and you both are in Germany, I believe, at Max Planck. Both at Max Planck. Max Planck, I believe is how you'd say it. Nada, you're both geneticists. Nada, you're a PhD student currently, and this is part of your thesis work. The study that we're going to talk about, you both worked on a paper titled Ancient DNA from the Green Sahara Reveals Ancestral North African Lineage. I found this to be very interesting as a paleoclimatologist because I'm overall interested in the phenomenon of the Green Sahara or the African humid period. So for people out there watching the Sahara, that great desert, those pictures of all the sand dunes, that is a kind of a recent development in geologic history, let's say. It has to do with changes in insolation due to Milankovitch cycles and precession specifically altered the rainfall patterns across North Africa, leading to desertification of the vast parts of the continent. But from about 14,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, it was wet. There were lakes. It was full of megafauna, giraffes and elephants and actually humans. And you both worked on a burial found within the Sahara in southern Libya at the Takarkori rock shelter, where people that were inhabiting this African humid period, this Green Sahara, were buried. They were buried in this cave. And I want to first go over a little bit about the background of the cave and what would have been around the cave in the African humid period. And then I want to get into the genetics and the archaeology of what you found. And it's very interesting because right now, this out of Africa theory is dominating our conversation of human migration. But it seems like branches kind of broke off in certain areas is kind of like what you found, I guess. We'll talk about it more in detail. But to begin, that was a long introduction. I normally don't do that. Johannes, Nana, please, welcome to the podcast. Let's start off with talking about the Takarkori rock shelter. Anata, maybe you can start off. And it's in southern Libya. Can you tell us about the geology, what was there when it was the wet period, and then what's there today?
Yeah. So the Takarkori rock shelter is located in, as you mentioned, in southwestern Libya. It is closer to the Algerian border. It actually hosts a rich and well preserved stratigraphic sequence that is dated between 10,000 years ago to 14,000 years ago. And it was also what we know from this stratigraphic sequence and also the other evidence, archaeological evidence, that it was used by the foragers group when the Sahara was green. Also, there was a transition in the material culture, which also evidence that it was also used by the pastoralist. And also the area itself is rich of various artwork or rock art depicting the life there, and also depicting most of the animals like giraffes, like a hippo, like cows, and also other herding animals. So this is what we know from the area, and there was the Takarkori rock shelter itself. So it is located in the Wadi Tadarat. In the wadi is called Tadarat Akakos Mountain. So between the wadis and the mountain itself. So we are collaborating with archaeologists, and this head by the team of the archaeologists was headed by Dr. Sabino Di Lernia, and they excavated the site a long time ago. That was between 2000, 2007. They found this interesting burial there. The burial had almost around 15 individuals. They were mostly women and children. And among them, they found two naturally mummified female, actually. So this natural mummification happened because of the extreme dry and hot of the weather, and also the rock shelter itself offers some kind of protection from heat, direct sun heat, and also offer moisture. So this is what's happening is mummification, natural mummification, meaning that the desiccation, the dehydration and desiccations preserved some soft tissue in this in this in some of the individuals, and that's why we could see some soft tissues in in the sampled two individuals. The individuals that we sampled are dated to the middle pastoralism. They lived during the golden age of the pastoralism at that time. Yeah, which roughly
And
happened between
what age would
7,000.
that be?
That was
7,000. And
direct.
that's radiocarbon dates on the actual mummies, or is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
inferred?
It
Okay.
was direct C14 dating dated to a 7,000-year-old BP, Cal BP. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's very interesting. So they're buried 7,000 years ago. That puts us near the end of the African humid period, but still well within it. And you
So,
mentioned, I think the rock art is very interesting in that area, because what does it depict again? Do they draw on the walls?
so mostly the herding animals, the cow, the sheep, the also the other animals, that the giraffes, for example, the
Hmm.
hippos. This is what I remember. Actually, I haven't been there, unfortunately. So,
Okay.
but this is what
No, it's,
what I have read
yeah,
and so also as well. Mm.
because today, would a hippo or a giraffe be able to live at that cave, or even a cow? If
Yeah.
based on, I haven't been there either, but based on you've studied it closer, could you raise a giraffe near that site today?
No, it's impossible. Yeah, it is one of the
It's way
harshest
too
environment.
dry. So this suggests that, like, I think that's interesting because it shows the degree of climate change that happened between when the people were buried at that Takarkori rock shelter and today. Because today, what is the site like? Isn't it an extremely dry desert? It's almost inhospitable to life, right?
It's impossible, yeah,
Pretty
to
much.
live. Yeah, the degree there is almost like 50 degrees, 50 Celsius, and
Hmm. And my understanding was there were lakes nearby this site too that are now completely dry, and those probably would have brought in the pastoralists and the megafauna. But today, those lakes dry that are within 100 kilometer of the site.
hmm. Yes, I didn't refresh my reading
Okay,
on this lake, but I what I remember that there were remains of some fish and some reptiles as well. Uh,
right,
yeah,
yeah, at the site
yeah,
there's
yeah,
also fish and
yeah. This
reptiles,
is what
and
I.
those fish obviously wouldn't be living anywhere near that site today, or brought in. So
Yeah,
I just think those are interesting kind of index to how extreme of an environmental change happened from the Green Sahara to today, and the
yeah,
world that existed in that time. And that would have big implications for the movement of humans, but it's kind of counterintuitive. Later on, you find out it seems like the Sahara wouldn't have been a barrier when it was wet. but it seems like it still was sort of a barrier, even when it was wet. But I don't want to jump too far ahead with like the implications of the data. Okay, so you're looking at two individuals. Let's look at like the two people. There are two people that were mummified naturally. So the DNA that you derived were from, I think, teeth and collagen, but they were preserved within dried flesh.
So the DNA we obtained are from as you mentioned, from root to a teeth root and another rib. So the DNA was well preserved more in the tooth root.
Okay, and the tooth root, yeah, that's usually, and the other parts of it, you didn't get as good results.
Yeah. So yeah, the material of the tooth root like preserve the DNA much more than what is in the rib. And actually, when we sample ancient DNA, we have done some various studies that explore which material is best for ancient DNA. And so what we know that is that what we found, Petrus bone is the best one that in preserving the ancient DNA because it is due to its structure. This is the Petrus bone, the bone that is behind the ear, and it comes in the second rank, the root, the tooth root. Yes. So yeah, but that
Okay,
was what this is what was available to
from
sample.
those
Yeah,
individuals.
yeah.
And how old were they? And they were, I think, female, correct?
They were. Yeah, the old or the age were estimated by anthropologists to be between 30 and 40 year. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
they were
And
adult.
you mentioned this is the golden age of pastoralism, and this is 7,000 years ago. So, what was before pastoralism, and what do you mean when you say pastoralists?
So the people, I mean, by pastoralists, the people rely on milk and food from herding animals like cows, like sheep
Okay,
and goat.
right.
But what was before that was foragers or foraging, a foraging period. So the people before that were depending on hunting and gathering for as a subsistence strategy. And so one of the interesting question that also our paper was trying to understand is that the shift between this subsistence strategy from foraging to pastoralism, did that happen, or did this cultural innovation happened locally, or this required migration, larger scale migration of human into the region to foster this transition? Yeah, and what we found at the end that the genetic this transition from foraging to pastoralism happened without cultural diffusion. So yeah, so that
Okay.
means that the foragers adopting this innovation culturally or locally. Yeah, yeah, without the need of
And they're mainly, they're doing
the
cattle and sheep, not
yeah
camels, or all of them?
camel. Yeah, probably camels as well. I remember I saw a photo or like one of the artwork also depict one camel. So, but I'm not entirely sure about if they were like camel were among the
Mhm.
animals used there.
Okay. Okay, that's, and then after this pastoralism, does this pastoralism go away after 5,000 when the desert really dries up, or does it, do you know what's the history of what follows pastoralism there?
So at the end of the pastoralism, as what I have read, that people sought more areas seeking for resources and water, and this is evident also in the archaeology that um, people were moved south to the Sahara and closer to the Sahel belt. That is between the
Okay.
belt that is between present day Sahara desert and the sub-Saharan region.
I got it.
This is what we know from the ending of the African human period.
Okay. So in other words, people kind of just abandon the area and they go south to the
Yeah,
more
yeah.
hospitable
They
climate.
sort exactly.
Okay. So during this pastoralist period, there probably weren't huge populations of people because that seems like a pretty low density type activity, people moving seasonally through the area for forage for their animals and staying at this rock shelter. Even that couldn't really hold on once it dries out. And so they just leave after 5,000 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah,
These areas are very well preserved today because of that, and they're very dry since then. Been, yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah, but also, I mean, connected to this point, we tried also to estimate the population size of from the genome we generated from the Takarkori. Yes, the individual. Yeah, there was a statistical like a method to estimate that would allow you to estimate the population size. So what we found that they were around 10 or 1,000 individual, roughly, and this means that it was like a medium size, not really super small group. Yeah,
Okay. That's
yeah,
really interesting. So let's get into the genetics then. Let's get into the technicals because people see press releases on DNA tells us this about that and where your heritage and they're mixed with Neanderthals, this amount and all this. And I'm a geologist, and to me, I have a hard time understanding. So I really want to try to, in our best way together, talk about the genetics and what you found. And then we can get into the population estimates after that. So let's start with you. You did the tooth DNA. You didn't do RNA on is this mitochondrial DNA or is this the other type of DNA? And like for the lay person, what kind of analysis did you do on it? Because I think you did some PCA and some statistics that I'm not familiar with. And you found an interesting thing about this population in North Africa at this rock shelter. So let's get into that. So you did the DNA of the tooth. Was it mitochondrial or the other type? Can you remind me of the two types of DNA you can analyze?
yeah. So for the mitochondrial DNA, actually, it was done in 2019 by another group. Or
Okay.
actually the group yes, they handed over the sample for us to continue on the autosomal DNA. So yeah, so the mitochondrial DNA was done in 2019, and they found that Takarkori individual carry an N basal haplogroup. And this N basal haplogroup is kind of a very basal, or actually that it was it was a haplogroup that, or maybe Johannes you can help me in this.
Yeah, so for the two individuals that were found at the Takarkori rock shelter, which is a rock shelter from about 7,000 years ago, close to a paleo lake. So now it's in the middle of the desert, but at the time when people were living there, this was a really lush and green environment where those people were practicing pastoralism. So they had goats and they had cattle that they were herding, and they were living from their milk and their meat. They didn't have camels yet. Camels were domesticated a bit later. So that's kind of what you would find today in this area. But at the time, it was actually
Yeah, that's
green
what I was
and
wondering.
lush. So actually cattle and goats could live there, and sheep. And so we got samples from teeth of those individuals and ribs. Unfortunately, the ribs were not really well preserved, but the teeth had good DNA preservation. And they were provided to us by a team from Florence, from Italy, that had analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of those individuals and had found that this mitochondrial DNA that they're carrying is a very deep lineage. It's actually a lineage that is found today in North Africa, but it's usually not found outside Africa. Only if there was some mixture, if some people moved from North Africa to Europe or to the Near East. And this deep lineage has separated from the lineages of people that you find outside Africa today, more than 45,000 years ago, but 50,000 years ago. So very deep lineage, which in itself was very interesting to find this deep lineage in those individuals. And we were interested to analyze the autosomal DNA, so not the mitochondrial, but the other DNA. So you have
Yeah, what
in
is
each
that?
cell, you have DNA from the cell nucleus, which we call the nuclear DNA, or the autosomes,
The
which is
nuclear.
46 chromosomes. And then you have the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell, and they carry their own DNA, which is called the mitochondrial DNA, which is usually passed on from the mother to the offspring. So unlike the nuclear DNA that is passed on from mother and father and mixes in each generation, this is just passed on from one generation to the next. And you can build phylogenetic trees with that. You can then basically see when those mitochondrial lineages, those maternal lineages of the mother's mother have separated from each other. And in this case, it was a very deep split, again, that is very old. So that was very interesting. It was very unusual. So that's why we were interested to also analyze the nuclear DNA that we then did. And for the nuclear DNA, what we found was similar to the mitochondrial DNA. This is a very deep lineage, a lineage that actually falls on the branch of people outside Africa. So outside Africa, we have Europeans, Asians, Australians, Native Americans, different groups that separated from each other about 45,000 years ago. They separated from the people in sub-Saharan Africa about 60,000 years ago. So there was this split of the groups. So the people that stayed in Africa and the people that left Africa. And Takarkori is just in between. It's actually not the group that we find outside Africa, but it's also not the group that we find in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a different group, largely in its genomic DNA. And that was quite interesting because we hypothesized that it's actually the original group of people that occupied North Africa between 60,000 and maybe 10, 12,000 years ago, when then other people moved into this region, which we have also shown in previous work in the past, where we could show there were other groups actually moving into North Africa, starting about 20,000 years ago from the Near East. And they mixed together with the people that were there before, like the Takarkori-like people.
Okay. So I have a few questions here. I'm like, one thing I'm wondering, first of all, is how did a population become isolated in Green Sahara? If it is green, there should be movement. Is there a mountain barrier? Did the desert persist in some areas? Is there any thinking on why this population became isolated there? Is it maybe a cultural reason?
That's one of the big questions, of course. What we did find, what Nada already said, is that we didn't see that this Takarkori population had genetically mixed with the people in sub-Saharan Africa. So there don't seem to be a connection between Takarkori and further south. But there also doesn't seem to be a connection between Takarkori and further north, because what I just mentioned, we found that starting probably about 20,000 years ago, people living in the Maghreb, so modern-day Morocco, they carried already a genetic signature from outside Africa, a Near Eastern signature, that was found in tiny amounts in Takarkori, but not in 50% like it was found earlier on in North Africa. So it seems indeed it was an isolated population, but we don't know how big that population was. As Nada said, that was probably not a small population because genetically they were quite diverse. And you could imagine that it was a bit like a patchwork. There were islands in the Sahara that were occupied, where you had lakes, where the climate was favorable for pastoralism or for hunter-gatherers. And there were some places that were still desert and were not easy to cross. So it was quite different to today. It's a bit more like you might find today in the Near East, where you have some dry regions that are really desert-like, and you have some regions that are green and where there are rivers and there are forests, and it was pretty patchy. And this might explain why there was not complete gene flow between north and south, so between north of the Sahara and sub-Saharan Africa. So it wasn't a corridor, at least for humans, as it seems, but maybe it was a patchwork, and populations were maybe a little bit in contact, but not as much as some people have suggested in the past, which is really one of the major findings of this study, that there was not a lot of gene flow across the Sahara during the African human period.
Yeah.
That was the part that fascinated me. Was I pictured it as a paleoclimate, like humans are just moving through the Sahara because it's wet. I think I like the idea of this patchwork of oases almost is a better way to think of the Sahara than it being just like this green, because I call it the humid period. You think like wet and foresty, but maybe not so much.
It's more like a steppe-like environment. It's like maybe like the Serengeti or something like that, right? So you have probably a lot of grassland, but not as kind of lush and green maybe as you see in East Africa today, and not as connected. Maybe more like the northern part of Kenya, where you have Lake Turkana, for example, which is a big lake.
Yeah.
But then around it is actually quite dry. And then you have other lakes, again, where it's quite wet, like Lake Nakuru. But then in between, you have also an area where there's not a lot of occupation because it's quite dry. So it's probably more patchwork than kind of like a consistent large steppe like the Serengeti.
Okay. Let's step back to look at the DNA. I'm glad you helped walk through we have the mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse. The mitochondria is in the cell, and then there's the nucleus of the cell, there's nuclear DNA. You found the mitochondrial DNA, which tracks the maternal line, splits off around 45,000 years ago, right? Did I remember that, write that down right? But the nuclear DNA suggests maybe 60,000 years ago. Did I get that correct? I know there's estimates on the splitting date, but I'm trying to get at, is there something going on in that middle place, like 50 to 70,000 years ago, that would move people into the Green Sahara that we know of? Like, is that the advent of the beginning of the Green Sahara, where people might have like tracked, or any thoughts on that?
No, it doesn't seem to be that there were people in the Green Sahara, as far as we can say, before 15,000 years. At least archaeologically, they're not present. So during the late Pleistocene, for most parts of the late Pleistocene, the Sahara was a desert like it is today. The African human period starts 15,000 years ago.
Yeah,
It ends about
15,000. Yeah.
it ends about 5,000 years ago. So we actually do not know where the ancestors of this population that we found there came from and how they were not connected to North Africa, because North Africa 15,000 years ago was already genetically admixed with non-Africans from the Near East, from a population that we think is close to sedentary hunter-gatherers, the so-called Natufians that were living in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this mixture seems to have happened about 20,000 years ago. So where did those people then come from to Takarkori? If they didn't have that mixture, there must have been still some place somewhere in North Africa that retained the rixial mixture, the population that had split 60,000 years ago from the sub-Saharan Africans. Part of that population went out of Africa, became Europeans, Asians, Australians, Americans. Part of that population stayed in North Africa. And then at some point, between 7,000 and 15,000, they moved into the Green Sahara. But we don't think that they were in the Green Sahara before, because there's no archaeology that supports that. But then it's not impossible. I mean, there's a whole lot of sand, and there's a whole lot of places that we might have not found. So it is also possible that there was some pocket of people still somewhere in Libya, maybe further south than kind of the northern coast. In terms of archaeology, there's very little archaeology for that time period in most of the Sahara. It's so dry.
It's so dry, and that's the thing I was trying to emphasize beginning, that like the area we're talking about is really a dry area. It's not pretty inhospitable in a way, right? Yeah. I've seen like some of these petroglyphs of giraffes just like on near sand dunes in the Sahara, and you're like, wow, for that to be, a lush enough place for a giraffe to like forage on trees and grass, then turn into a sand dune within a few thousand years is pretty ridiculous. And I guess in short-lived too, very short-lived. 15,000 years ago, it turned on and ended about 5,000 years ago. Okay, so I don't want to bore everyone too much, but I have two experts here in DNA, and DNA is always in science headlines. You analyze the nuclear DNA. Can you tell us like a little bit about the technicals of how you can determine where these people come from and how they split from other populations, if you will, and then you place, you say this happens 45,000 years ago or something. How do you know that? And anyone wants to start on that?
Nada, you want to give it a first try?
So after analyzing or after obtaining the DNA in the lab, this DNA comes as a big data. So we analyze this data, and there are several statistical methods that to help you to create to understand and to characterize this. So, for example, we start with a PCA. This PCA is a sort of like a basic analysis to start with. It's actually a dimensional reduction method to see if this individual or this group cluster with which. So we know that there are certain cluster for people from Africa, for Eurasia, for South Africa, East Asia, and etc. And then we did some analysis to narrow down where Takarkori is, or what is Takarkori. So we did like one test. It's called F3 outgroup statistic. It is just to test us the connection, the genetic connection, or genetic drift, actually, which is the genetic change, random genetic change over time. And we found that Takarkori has the highest genetic affinity with Taforalt. And from that, we moved into another step that, after Taforalt, do we have another ancestry that we can share extra affinity with Takarkori on top of Taforalt? But we did not find anything. And then after that, we do another type of test that is called with the QP graph, with the
admixtrog.
This is the admixtrog. The admixtrog we use to estimate the Neanderthal. Yeah, maybe we can show this in slides.
Okay.
Exactly, the Neanderthal.
Yeah, I'll show anything I'll show slides of technical stuff that I find. Okay, let's just hold on just for 1 second here, because this is really cool. You said a word, Taforalt. You said
Taforalt.
Genetics point to Taforalt, which is, or how'd you say it again?
Yeah, actually, I mispronounce it. It's actually Taforalt.
Okay, what is that?
Okay.
The ancient, so I hear Natufi, and nobody knows what any of that means. So
yes.
Well, if you describe, like, that's a group from South Africa or something like that.
Exactly. Yes. So in this test, as we see in the slide, that this test is called F3 outgroup test, and we test the genetic affinity between Takarkori and several ancient group. So what we see here in the map, that there are many circles spanning all the Eurasia and Africa region. So, and these colors, this is the output of the test. So the more dark color, that the highest indicate the highest affinity. So what we see here is the highest affinity comes with the Taforalt group. Taforalt is a cave found in Morocco, and the people who live there is, we give it just a name, Taforalt people, and they are 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherer. They were foraging. And from this test, we see that there was that Takarkori, although the individual we have is Takarkori individual is 7,000-year-old only, but it has deep connection into Taforalt that predates it by also 8,000 years.
You're right.
So this indicates a long genetic stability among North African foragers. So yeah, this is like the kind of first test we did. And then we moved into another test that is to find out that the Takarkori actually was an isolate. The other test is that in which we put also we test several group, ancient and modern, to see if they have certain affinity with Takarkori on top of what we know, that the connection between Taforalt and Takarkori individuals. But we did not find anything. So what we see here maybe this is technical, like in the plot, but we'll not go into the detail. But what's important here is that anything in the right side that is that means closer to Taforalt people, and anything in the left that this group show more affinity with Takarkori. So we did not find anything in the left side. Anything has a negative value. So there wasn't any group that share extra affinity with Takarkori. That this is indicate to us that Takarkori is likely an isolate. And also,
right.
Yeah, exactly. And the other interesting observation here, that what Johannes mentioned, is that we found that the sub-Saharan African groups are symmetrically distant or equally distant from both Takarkori and Taforalt. So this suggests that there wasn't a gene flow from south of the Sahara to the probably due to the ecological barrier, the fragmentary habitats we had. Or it had in the green area. So this kind of sort of our work in simplified words, and then we after that we moved into another type of test that so we have this interesting ancestral North African lineage. How close is it to the people who lived outside Africa? First migrated from Africa to the Eurasia. And for that, we also used this F4 statistic to test if Takarkori is closer to the ancestry of a people in the Slatikun individual. And Slatikun is also a type, is also a name of a cave, similar to the Taforalt story. So a cave that is in Czech Republic. And this individual is much, much older than even Taforalt. It is 45,000 year old. It is actually among the first migrant who supposedly went from Africa and lived in the Eurasia. So the question we had in mind. So Takarkori, is it closer to sub-Saharan African, which is geographically closer to, or is it closer to the people who lived outside Africa, to the out of Africa ancestry? Yeah, and we find from that Takarkori is closer to the outside of Africa ancestry. So, it is closer to the Slatikun individual than to the sub-Saharan African.
Okay, so I need to digest this for a second. I'm just thinking about that because that's interesting. That it's closer to the individual genetically to a Czech burial 45,000 years old than similar age individuals from sub-Sahara Africa, statistically speaking.
Yeah.
So that's kind of counterintuitive, right? I mean, or am I just being dramatic?
So Takarkori is already on the branch of out of Africa. That's this sort of analysis it narrows down the final or the final topography the final phylogeny that we try to create, or actually it's still a theoretical, but we try to find where Takarkori does fall.
Okay. That's very interesting. I guess the takeaway I'm taking here is that there's a stable population of pastoralists, maybe at these oases in North Africa for a long time, and they didn't mix very much with outside people, and they seem to be the same genetic people that kind of left Africa as well, in a way. The second part I want to get into is, so how do we get the ages of these divergences, assuming they're not derived from radiocarbon? And then tell me about this Neanderthal mixture stuff. So the Neolithic farmers of Western Eurasia are full of Neanderthal genetics, or relatively speaking, compared to the Takarkori people who have a very small percentage of Neanderthal. So maybe we'll split up these two questions. We can maybe talk about how do we derive the age, and then let's talk about the mixture with Neanderthal genetics. So let's do age first. How do you determine the age of these divergences?
So
genetically,
if we then separate again the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, in some ways, it's a bit easier because, as I mentioned before, the mitochondrial DNA is passed on from the mother to the offspring. So it allows you to build a phylogenetic tree, a tree of all the mothers, like a basically relationship tree of all the mothers. And we have a lot of those mitochondrial genomes from the past. So we have some from 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. The oldest ones we have are 45,000 years old, like the ones that Nada just mentioned from this woman from Czech Republic. And if we take all those mitochondrial genomes we have from people outside Africa, and they are radiocarbon dated because the skeleton is radiocarbon dated, we can basically build a tree, and we know every point in that tree, and that allows us to then calculate when the last common ancestor lives, because there's something called the molecular clock. So mutations happen through time. So we can then actually date how many mutations happen through time, how many changes happen to make a branch in a tree. And then you can actually infer the most recent common ancestor of two branches by just counting the number of mutations that were happening until a certain point. And then we can also calculate back in time when the branches are separated from each other. So you can basically use the fact that we have something from the past that is 20,000 years old, compare that to something else from the past or something from the present, and then we know how many mutations happen per year. It allows us to calibrate a molecular clock and then know when did something happen in the past by extrapolating from the observations that are happening on those branches. And then when we get a most recent common ancestor of all those mitochondrial genomes, for example, of 50,000 years, and the haplogroup, the type of mitochondrial DNA found in Takarkori, has separated from those others 50,000 years ago. So this is a way how we get that age when it separates, by basically having a lot of data points from a lot of those branches on the tree, and then inferring when one separated from the other, which works really nicely. So this is for mitochondrial DNA. For nuclear DNA, it's a bit more difficult. There we are often looking at the patterns that Nada just described about certain relationships to certain groups. And if we find that the Takarkori is part of the non-African branch, it is closer to people outside Africa than people in sub-Saharan Africa, we know it's on the branch of people outside Africa. At the same time, coming to your second question, it doesn't have Neanderthal DNA like all the people outside Africa. And we do know that the admixture with Neanderthals happened 47,000 years ago, but it doesn't share that. So therefore, the branch of Takarkori is older than 47,000 years. So it has separated sometime between all people outside Africa, separating from the people in sub-Saharan Africa, 1,000 years. So sometime between 60,000 years ago and 47,000 years ago. We don't know if it was 55, 52. The mitochondrial DNA tells us it's around 50, maybe 55,000 years. So somewhere in around that time. We can't date it much closer because there's too much uncertainty around it. But more than 50,000 years ago, likely, it has separated from non-Africans, where we have the nuclear and the mitochondrial genomes. And then again, it lacks the Neanderthal admixture that all people outside Africa show. But that's maybe also not a big surprise, because there were no Neanderthals in the Sahara. There were no Neanderthals in North Africa, how far we can say. There were no Neanderthals in Africa, period. So why should it have Neanderthal DNA if there were no Neanderthals there? But all people outside Africa have the same amount of Neanderthal DNA. All people outside Africa share an event where Neanderthals and humans coming out of Africa hybridized and carry this Neanderthal DNA, but they probably lived on that lineage that separated from the lineage that led to Europeans and Asians before they had mixed with Neanderthals, sometime before 47,000 years ago. But that lineage stayed behind in Africa, whereas the other lineage that went into Europe and Asia, which became Europeans, Asians, Australian Aborigines, Native Americans, they had admixed with Neanderthals, probably somewhere in the Near East. That is the best guess that we currently have, because Neanderthals were living in what is today, for example, Israel. There were Neanderthals there when modern humans came out of Africa. And that's the most likely place in the Near East, somewhere where this admixture happened. But that's not shared with Takarkori, because they stayed behind. And that also then tells us that they have separated a long time ago from the people outside Africa. Even though they're closer to Europeans and Asians compared to sub-Saharan Africans, they don't share the same history because they remained in Africa. At least that's the implications from that observation.
That's very interesting. I'm starting to think now, I didn't even realize this. So Neanderthals are evolved in Eurasia. They clearly were derived from hominins, which came from Africa, but they are kind of an Eurasian phenomenon. I didn't even put that together ever but they made it all the way as close as the Near East, but they're not in Libya, Egypt, as far as we at least haven't any evidence found. That's weird. That's really, really weird.
I mean, you can think about the Neanderthals as a highly adapted specialized Ice Age human population. They came to Eurasia when it was really cold during the Ice Ages. They were really good in hunting mammoth. They were killing megafauna. They were living in caves there. It's a kind of like stereotypic Paleolithic kind of human. And maybe they were not well adapted to live in Africa, where the environment was very different and where they hadn't evolved. So they evolved outside Africa. But as far as we know, they never made it into Africa. At least there's no archaeological traces of them. If they made it to Africa, they haven't left anything behind for us to know that.
You learn something new every day. I mean, I guess that's why I do this channel, because that just is so weird to me. So it must have been Homo erectus or Homo habilis that made it out of Africa before Homo sapiens, and then they turned into Neanderthals.
That's the current thinking, that there is a common ancestor of Neanderthals, modern humans, and the other group we haven't talked about, which are the Denisovans, which is the other East Asian group of archaic humans. They all together have a common ancestor about 600,000 years ago. How you call that ancestor? I prefer Homo erectus, but you might also call it Homo heidelbergensis, which some people also use as a term. But we don't really know exactly. There's a lot of questions about what that group was. But as they separated from modern humans, and modern humans come out of Africa, it's probably happening in Africa, probably group leaving Africa. And at the time before that in Africa, you have Homo ergaster, which is Homo erectus, which is kind of the same thing, which is the common ancestor of them all. And they left Africa 500,000, 600,000 years ago. One becomes in Europe Neanderthals, the other one moves to Asia, becomes Denisovans. And then when modern humans come out of Africa 50,000 years ago, they meet them in the Near East. And they mix with them 47,000 years ago. And then they carry the Neanderthal DNA into Europe, Asia, Australia, and into the Americas.
In a way, this out of Africa hypothesis is, we always think about it as a Homo sapien event, but it seems like two major hominid waves out of Africa that then together mixed into modern Homo sapiens.
And I don't want to make it even more complicated, but there's very strong genetic evidence for another out of Africa event that happens around 300,000 years ago, where an early group of modern humans have left Africa and contributed genetically to Neanderthals. So there is signatures in Neanderthals that kind of suggest that there was an earlier admixture. And there is an out of Africa event of modern humans around 100,000 years ago, because in Israel you have human remains like Skul and Kafze, which are very clearly modern humans, but they're more than 100,000 years old, and they cannot be part of the kind of genetic makeup of the kind of later on modern humans because they're too old, but they have made it out of Africa. So there are multiple events. So Africa seems to have been the powerhouse for most of our evolution. This is where our deep lineage evolves, starting at 7 million years ago. And then about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus makes it out of Africa, goes to Georgia, goes to Southeast Asia, and then modern humans. Then there's this ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans. They make it out of Africa 500,000 years ago. Then an early modern humans 300,000 years ago. Then another modern human 50,000 years ago. And it's always out of Africa. As far as we can say, there's not much back into Africa.
It's like Africa just generates these two-legged hominids. They just keep coming out and they're just messing up everybody's ecosystem.
Is just also a very big place, right? I mean, we are always so much biased by the Mercator projection of our map, where Africa looks quite small. But Africa is huge, right? Compared to the other places.
Congo is like the size of like half of the continental US. People forget that. The Congo is absolutely enormous. Yeah, I forget about that. It is just a powerhouse landmass, and it's got that huge gradient latitudinally, and then you're moving with climate change, with changing ecosystems, and that's maybe playing into evolution a little bit. But that's pretty wild. I got to like sit and digest this for a while. I don't even really know. But so we have, I think this is interesting overall, that this North Africa oasis patchwork theory is very cool to me, in that it was a stable kind of isolated population, at least you can tell, up there. You mentioned earlier, Nada, maybe you can talk about this idea of the pastoralism came in via like a transmission versus it replacing the population. So you're saying the people that were hunter-gatherers there took up a new lifestyle. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit. Why was that an interesting finding?
Yeah, so the pastoral, the transition into pastoralism happened in Africa and in other in different regions. But what the archaeogenetic studies told us about, for example, the East African, the transition from foraging to pastoralism, it actually it was coupled with human migration into East Africa. And so but we didn't know that what happened in the Sahara was that like a cultural innovation. So people foraging developed themselves, like developed their own way into of basketry or pottery, and developing their own tools to this like a life changing or way of of on the subsistence itself. So this was like the question we are, and this was also asked by archaeologists, if the transition we see in the Sahara and the people when adopting the animals and use their milk, their meat, and was that did that happen did the people develop themselves all these ideas, or that there was a large scale migration from outside Africa, probably likely from the Levant, who helps these people or the foragers actually to acquire this new lifestyle. But what we found that no, the foragers are and the Takarkori are genetically stable. So people who lived in the Sahara actually they develop their own local methods of transitioning into the pastoralism and herding the animals themselves. Yeah, this is what we found, because also the amount of the gene flow we found from the Levant is very, very minimal, which is represented in the amount of the Neanderthal.
Yeah.
So
right.
this does not indicate yes, a larger scale migration from outside Africa. So yeah, they were innovator, and but actually what helped also them to this transition is as the climate changes also. So the people when the climate tends to be drier, so yes, this also was motivator or motivating the people to sow to seek water resources and having this new life, new ways of looking after or looking for the foods.
Right. In most of the areas of the world that I study, which is America, there's this big megafauna extinction around 13,000 years ago that's probably due to expansion of humans, Clovis, climate change mixture. I think depends on where you're at. Do we see a large megafauna extinction in Africa the same way? I don't want to answer, but I don't think we do, right? Around 13,000 years ago, there isn't a big. Is there evidence for a big change then?
So we
And
think
anyone can
that
answer who feels.
we
Go
think that
ahead.
the megafauna extinction that happens in multiple places in the world is linked to the activity of modern humans. Modern humans, however, evolved in Africa. So the megafauna of Africa, giraffes, hippos, elephants, they co-evolved. Some people even say they're more afraid of humans. Kind of experienced that myself being on safari. As soon as you step out of the car, all the animals are gone. Whereas in North America, you can actually walk up an elk. They feed off your hand. They're not afraid. Like in a lot of places, humans are not seen as a dangerous animal to animals. But in Africa, they are. Probably they co-evolved. That's at least kind of a hypothesis that some people have. We see a megafauna extinction in Europe around 40,000 years ago starting. So modern humans come here, mammoth goes extinct, woolly rhino goes extinct, hyenas go extinct, cave lions go extinct, buffaloes go extinct. So there's a big genetic change with the appearance of modern humans. The same happens in Australia. 45,000 years ago, modern humans come to Australia. All the mega, like super big marsupials, like 3-meter large kangaroos and wombats and what have you, they all go extinct. Asia is the same. So there's a mega extinction happening, but that happens earlier than the Americas. Why? Because people only come to the Americas 13,000 years ago, because there's a big glacier, so they can't get there, because it's just, there's no way to go into the Americas. So only when the glaciers disappear, when it gets warmer, people come there, all the megafauna goes extinct as well. So this is probably modern humans. Also coming to the Pacific, to New Zealand, for example, there's a lot of big birds. Modern humans come there, and like after 50 years, they're all extinct. So moderns are really good in extinguishing megafauna, because they're good hunters, because of their technology and because of how we can communicate and how smart we are. But yeah, that happens at different places at different times, because modern humans come to different places at different times. In North Africa, we have a mega extinction, but that's because of the desert after the African Union
so
period.
that's the desert. So this is a climate change driven.
The climate change that there's no giraffes today in Morocco. There's no hippos today in Morocco, but they disappear with the climate change, right? So that happens when it gets dry 5,000, 4,000 years ago. And then they disappear. But that's not because of human activity. That's climate change, as far as we can say, because the habitat isn't there, right? There's no lakes where the hippos could be in the desert today.
Okay, because I was wondering, maybe if there's a link between the extinction of the megafauna and the growth of pastoralism. Like they kind of took the auroch and they were like, we're gonna like bring this into our sphere of influence because we don't want to see it just killed. We learned how to breed them, but that doesn't seem to be the case with that. It seems as though also I talked to a couple people, some mammoth experts and other paleontologists, and I'm starting to realize that a few megafauna saved themselves from extinction just by becoming domesticated. Like the one example I think of is the mammoth. Is the range of the mammoth is all through the New World, all through Siberia, all through Western Europe. It shrunk down to the modern range of the elephant. If you look at the modern range of the elephant 100, 200, 300 years ago, that's essentially the world where that's where the mammoths, they were killed down to that point. And then a lot of the cultures in the middle and early Holocene started using elephants for warfare, especially like in India and Southeast Asia. So they actually started to utilize this big megafauna. And I wonder, just a guess, I wonder if like, hey, they saved themselves.
You can say that, but an elephant and a mammoth is as close as a gorilla and a human.
Really?
There's 6 million years diverged from each other. It's a very different animal, right?
That's a very different. Okay, because my feeling was that they were pretty closely genetically related to the modern elephant.
No, not at all. They're further distant than a tiger and a lion. A tiger and a lion are closer related to each other than a mammoth and an elephant.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And the other example would be the auroch. The auroch goes extinct, but essentially doesn't go extinct because its domestic ancestor is the cow, right?
I mean, partially it mixes into the cows because there is just 1 billion cattle on the planet today. I mean, not so much in the past, but then, wild animals disappear because they mix into kind of domestic animals as part of the story. The last aurochs goes extinct in the 18th century. It's actually quite late. Was around in Europe a couple of 100 years ago. So it's not like a very deep extinction, but then they're hunted down because of overpopulation and partially mixing into the European cattle, but not to a large extent. But there are also a lot of cattle. But the cattle is really, the cattle comes from the Near East and has been domesticated there 10,000 years ago. And there's a little bit of mixture of aurochs into it, but not a lot. So it is basically cattle from the Near East. It's not the European aurochs that mixes in there, as far as we can say. And then, of course, there are other bovines in Cebu, for example, that is from the South Asia, and the water buffalo and the yak. And there's a whole bunch of bovines. Yak is still existing as a wild form, but the Taurus cattle is not. So that our ox is extinct. I do have to leave now, in fact.
Okay.
If you have one more question for me, maybe Nada also has to leave. I don't know, but I I
Yeah.
have my
Yeah,
wife
no, we
waiting
can.
with dinner.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can wrap up. I think I covered everything relevant to your study, and I just like to talk about genetics. I was going to get into the zebra and the horse, but let's hold off at that point right now. So I think to leave off, if somebody's interested in this study, anything we should look out for in the upcoming future in terms of papers that you think would be interesting that you want to plug here? Johannes, did you have something you wanted to say?
I think the paper shows how kind of limited our standing of North Africa is, and that we need to have much more data from this region, from other regions in North Africa. There's a very big mystery there. There's even more mystery if we go further back in time, because we now talked about the genetic lineage that was there 60,000 years ago. But what genetic lineage was there 100,000 years ago? Because that should also not be classical sub-Saharan Africans. So there is some really big kind of mysteries hidden. And unlike most of sub-Saharan Africa, where preservation does not allow to study ancient DNA, North Africa, at least, you can go further back in time. That's where we have the oldest genomes from the Pleistocene so far, about 15,000 years ago from Morocco. So I would hope that maybe in the future we get some older DNA from maybe the Atlas Mountains, or, somewhere high altitude where you have a lot of preservation, and that we can go further back in time and then understand the mystery of North Africa. And that's true for the Northwest, like the Maghreb, but it's also true for the Northeast, like what Nada's studying, the Egyptian mummies. I think they will also potentially give us a bit better understanding about the connection between the Near East and Africa, because genetically there's a close connection between those two regions and neighboring regions, and of course regions that have been in genetic contact over 10,000 years probably.
Very cool. Well, on that note, I want to end. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to talk with us about your paper. The title being Ancient DNA from the Green Sahara Reveals Ancestral North African Lineage. Thanks again for coming on. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, David.
Thank you. Bye.